Joining us now is The Intercept's Ken Klippenstein to talk about his latest scoop. We can put this up here. Inside the Pentagon's new Perception Management Office to counter disinformation. So, Ken, to start with, before we get into the details of this, how'd you come on this latest scoop?
Well, you guys had me on recently for my last one, which is the establishment of the Foreign Malign Influence Center, established in the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, which also was not disclosed, a multi-million-dollar agency that's established, never, no press release telling the public that this thing exists. And so since reporting that, I kind of alluded to this agency we're talking about now, and I got some people reached out to me. It sort of shook the trees. People inside the community reached out and said, "Oh, it's funny. You just noticed that. Thanks for catching up with us."
Right,
because they had established it last year, actually.
And its only public record was it was mentioned in a list
in a budget
document
as like a line
item, like money for this office, but nothing else,
and not even the money. They didn't tell you how much money. They just
money.
Said this,
money for this thing. So I want to read one part of your story and get you to unpack a little bit. And this is a document that when you shook the trees, right. This is one of the documents that fell out. And so it's like kind of a university assignment. It's kind of weird, interesting how it
Yeah, they contract with these private institutions, and it's not entirely clear what, to some extent, when it concerns speech, that helps them get around certain First Amendment protections, because they're saying, oh, actually, the private group is what's doing this.
Right. And so the document says, let's say DOD wants to influence country A's leaders to stop purchasing a weapon system from country B because we believe the continued purchasing might jeopardize DOD's military advantage in some way if the U.S. ever had to engage in armed conflict with country A. Assuming the IPMO has worked to establish the desired behavior change, how might key influencers be identified that have sway over these leaders' thought processes, beliefs, motives, reasoning, etc., including ascertaining their typical modes and methods of communication? Thereafter, assuming an influence strategy is developed, how might the DIE or IC determine if DOD's influence activities are working, aside from waiting and watching, hopefully, that country A eventually stops purchasing the weapon systems in question from country B? So translate that. What is this office tasking itself with?
Yeah, so as the name suggests, they're managing the perceptions of foreign governments and foreign nationals. But part of the concern is that in the age of the internet, it's really hard to limit the, public diplomacy is what they call it, but really it's propaganda. It's really hard to target that at a foreign audience and not have it blow back on domestic, because the distinction has been completely dissolved between foreign and domestic. In fact, the law was even changed to reflect that. We have a long-standing law established after World War II. Of course, there were tons of propaganda at the time, and so this law was created in response to. It's called the Smith-Mundt Act. It's supposed to limit public diplomacy that's targeted at domestic Americans. Well, there was a Smith-Mundt, it was called the Modernization Act. It was rolled into the NDAA several years ago. And what that did is it got rid of that protection. There's no longer that protection that once existed. And their rationale for it was kind of interesting. They said, well, in the age of the internet, this stuff isn't really meaningful anyways. It's like, well, so that means we should take it extra seriously, right? But instead, they just threw it out of the window entirely.
Well, and the history of this is really interesting, not just with Smith-Mundt, but with the term perception management going all the way back to the Contras. Can you tell us a little bit, Ken, about the intelligence community's concept of perception management historically, sort of what it evolved from?
Yeah, so perception management is a term of art from, as you said, the Reagan administration. It was what they used. He assigned CIA's top propaganda expert to the National Security Council at the time to perception manage, to shape the narrative around the Contras, because they were, found responsible for all kinds of, horrible atrocities and really grisly crimes. And so it became important, and they were coming out of they were coming out of the Vietnam War. And so the concern was, how do we kick the Vietnam syndrome? This idea that the public is just, averse to any sort of foreign policy because of what they learned from Vietnam. And so this was kind of their response to it, is we're going to shape the public narrative around these things, particularly in foreign press. But even then, there were problems with that because, as we know, wire services like Reuters are based in other countries, and so they have circulation within the United States. So there were always problems with this foreign versus domestic distinction. But now even the kind of paper-thin wall that they had separating the two has been just completely removed. So that's sort of the historical context for it. And there's one more thing. And then during the Bush administration.
But wait, there's more.
Yeah, but wait, the Billy Mays. So during the Bush administration, there was another attempt under then Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld to stand up a perception management office right after 9/11, but before the invasion of Iraq. And then when it became public that he had done this, and that they were planning disinformation that was actually getting picked up by the American press and misinforming them about things that were going on in the so-called global war on terror. There was enormous pressure to shut it down, and he ended up doing that. And so what's interesting is there's no attendant outrage now, perhaps because we're not in a war climate or whatever, but it's the same thing. It's not just a perception management effort. It's within DOD, which is what happened during the Bush administration.
Under a Democratic president who was obviously an opponent of the Bush administration.
Right.
And as you write, the New York Times is the one that kind of called out the Office of Strategic Influence, as Rumsfeld called it, and pointed out that in countering disinformation, oftentimes they were like putting out their own disinformation to do that. And it's just so remarkable to think of the New York Times in the run-up to the Iraq War complaining about the administration putting out disinformation. The entire war was predicated on disinformation that the Bush administration was funneling through the New York Times.
Well, that's kind of the sleight of hand in all of this, is they try to say, as a senior defense official who works in the PSYOPs area told me, he was laughing at that. I in my previous story, just kind of candidly said propaganda. He's like, you're not supposed to say that. The monocles are going to be dropping all over Washington. He's like, it's called public diplomacy, Ken. And so that's kind of the sleight of hand they do, because they say, oh, we're actually countering falsehoods with the reality. But then when you break down the facts, it's like this stuff is politicized as anything, because they have their own set of political motives and interests. So that distinction between countering disinformation and propaganda is I think, a lot thinner than people generally recognize.
How many small, little, barely publicized offices in the Pentagon do you think you will uncover for the remainder of the year?
I actually just got another one since publishing this story, and that will be my next story. Okay. But what's interesting about the Pentagon is that what's happening, and with this office and the office I mentioned before, the Foreign Malign Influence Center, these are highly classified efforts that exist in what's called the high side. So they have special skiffs where they're talking about things. There's a culture of secrecy. When I reported initially on the Department of Homeland Security, most of that stuff is unclassified. So in DHS, there's almost half a dozen counter-disinformation entities established since 2016. So that gives you an idea. But this is just what we know from DOD. I'm sure there are more, but it's a lot harder to find. And it's a lot harder to find specifics about what exactly it is that they're doing.
And this is a kind of a how government works type of situation, too, because once something becomes the thing to do within the government, then everybody has to have their own office. Like, remember how you're like, wait, the post office has a counter-terror operator or whatever?
Yes.
Why's the post office doing? And the post office is like, hey, there was anthrax in the mail, so we got to do our own intelligence. And so if it becomes a thing that you think you can go to Congress and get more funding for, and so clearly I think what you're exposing here is that there's so much momentum on this side that if you're a bureaucrat who wants more funding, actually that's redundant, all bureaucrats want more funding, then the thing that you need to do is say, we're going to counter disinformation and we're going to do public diplomacy, and here's why we are uniquely capable of filling this role, and it's outrageous that we do not yet have our own office that is directed in this fashion.
Well, and if I could add on to that, turning it over to you, Ken, that this is all coming in the context. I mean, just in the last couple of weeks, we talked about the Durham report earlier, which even the FBI has conceded in a tweet that it posted this week. It already, sort of handled the errors, that's their claim, that were uncovered in the Durham report, but basically it's a concession that things went wrong, that the intelligence was not handled properly. January 6th, the intelligence was not handled properly. The CIA involvement in the 51 officials of the Hunter Biden laptop letter, that was false intelligence as well. That was intelligence spreading false information. And so they use all of these things. I'm assuming in your reporting you've realized this. It seems as though they're using all of these things to say we need more power because things are, there's just such a need for strong intelligence. We need more resources. We need more offices, more bureaucrats, despite the fact that what we're seeing is actually just their system is broken.
Yeah, it's always a cui bono kind of thing. Like when you have this sort of hysteria around things, who benefits, and it's often the national security state. They take full advantage of these things. I mean, the elevation of the idea of falsehoods to a new status, disinformation. It is just falsehoods. Why do we need a special national security-ized term for that? And I think we're seeing why, because then they can go to Congress and say, well, we need to counter the we need to counter the threat.
Vicious cycle.
As these offices proliferate, they're going to then be in competition with each other for congressional
That's why they're leaking.
funding.
That's why they're leaking to me.
And power, and they're going to start spreading disinformation about each other. Like they absolutely.
Well, that's what's extraordinary. So the previous one, the FMIC that I reported on, came on to discuss with you guys about a week ago. That's just to orchestrate and coordinate between all the various. They don't even handle anything internal. This is like a top level effort to manage everything else. So it's like it never ends, you know. And the secrecy is just a windfall for them, because we're in the context of this debate about like cutting food stamps and how are we going to save money. And there's these multi-million-dollar agencies. The DoD is completely exempt from this. I mean, we can have a discussion like if a certain number of people want to reduce the size of government. Okay, it's like. But shouldn't we talk about this $800 billion colossus?
Front and
It is
center.
completely out of the discussion.
That's a great point.
All right, well, I'm sure we'll have Ken back next week to talk about the newest disinformation.
They're just like popping up like Easter eggs. Ken, thank you so much. You can check out Ken's story, obviously, over on The Intercept. We will be back next Wednesday with more counterpoints. We're really looking forward to the new studio. We keep seeing teasers of it from Mac and Griffin, and man, it looks cool.
Yeah, it's going to be good. It's going to be right over there.
It's going to be right over there. It's coming soon, too, so
We'll keep the
tuned.
bricks for like the tours that we give, right?
Just for the nostalgia.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we'll be back next week with more counterpoints. Thank you so much for tuning in. We'll see you then.
Hey guys, ready or not, 2024 is fully upon us now, and Sagar and I have been brainstorming ways that we can really up our game for this critical election.
I just wonder how
We
long
rely
this is
on
going
our
to. It's
premium
quite a gravy
subs to
train.
expand our coverage, add
know,
staff,
like,
up the
eventually they
studio.
gotta
We
run
just
out.
want
Also,
to
I'm
give you
amazed
the
all these
best
Republicans
independent
are
coverage
so.
of this election, which is possible. So if you can help us out, become a premium subscriber today, breakingpoints.com, or the link is down here in the description video. It really means the world to us, and if you like what we're all about, this is the best possible way to keep us 100% independent, working only for you.